Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be talking about our first impressions on some of the newly revealed cards from the Wild Force and Cyber Judge sets. This isn't the full set list just yet, but it did seem like there were some really impactful cards, possibly some new archetypes coming out from the reveals as well, and some interesting ace specs which might actually be challenging Prime Catcher, which is something we didn't expect to say. So yeah, because they were impactful enough and me and Jack were just having a chat about them anyway, we thought we may as well put the recorder on and talk about these in a bit more detail. So Jack, do you want to start us off here with Order Box?
Yeah, as always, we will start with some trainers just because they typically go into more decks, and Order Box is the first, it's an item card. If you use the card, your turn ends, so it's already a bit of a bad start, so it has to be a really powerful effect to see play. You're going to search your deck for 2 items, reveal them, and put them into your hand. It's a pretty strong effect, but at the heart of it, your turn ends, and typically those cards are not usually strong enough. Obviously, potentially earlier in the game, this could be good because you can force Iono and stuff out of your opponent a little bit earlier than maybe they would want to play it. But the fact that Iono is in plenty of decks, it's a very powerful supporter right now, means that you may end your turn and not actually get any value out of playing this card whatsoever. You also need to play a lot of these to be able to find it when you want. You could potentially play it in like an Arven deck and try and tutor it out with Arven, but again, a lot of the time you're going to be going for the Poffin or finding a rare candy for your combo and stuff like that. So it feels like a lot of the time you can just find the item you want with Arven rather than trying to cherry pick 2 pieces for the next turn, especially when you're kind of advertising to the opponent they're going to be able to Iono them away anyway. So yeah, very powerful effect, but ultimately because your turn ends and we're in a format with plenty of Iono right now, I don't think it's quite going to see play even in decks that can tutor it out on turn 1, so you don't have to end up playing 4. Just ending your turn is just not good enough, to be honest.
Yeah, we do have the Hand Clippers. This is a pretty interesting item card. Both players discard cards in their hand until they both have 5 cards remaining. Your opponent discards first. But this seems like a really decent controlling card, actually, where your opponent can just basically draw pass and announce attacks into you in certain instances, where they're like using a lone attacker or whatnot, not wanting to cycle through their deck, not wanting to play resources from their hand so they can have enough to get through the game. Sometimes something like a Snorlax after a number of turns could go for Hand Clippers, and even though they're getting to keep, you know, sort of the 5 best answer cards or whatever, they lose a lot of options as they go. And also, there are situations where your opponent could Iono a ton of cards back into their deck and like re-fatten their deck, essentially. If they just wait till the very end and they have no cards left in their deck, they can play this Iono and get a huge chunk of things back. So Hand Clippers makes that no longer an option, and I think that's pretty good for the Snorlax players who are losing a lot of cards to rotation. So this actually allows them to be a bit more proactive, give your opponent something else to think about, which is kind of interesting. And there is going to be a Great Tusk to look at as well from this set, which is also trying to mill cards from the opponent's deck. So for exactly that strategy, like I was saying, if Iono is going to be a way to get a ton of resources back into the deck and sort of reload your clock against them, Hand Clippers will make that a lot less relevant. This actually used to be a supporter effect in Hue, and that did see some plays, so yeah, I do expect this to be a decent card, especially because there's, you know, Arven engines in a lot of these controlling decks. Getting the timing right with this card is pretty easy. So yeah, it seems like a pretty decent card. Probably not good enough for like generic decks, but could be a small factor of disruption if you can't reave in an Iono or something like that. I don't think it's that powerful, but it can at least stop some decks like Goldengo, for example, which can really grow large hand sizes and this, that, and the other. Maybe Gardevoir to an extent as well. Some of these decks that do grow those large hand sizes, maybe after a ton of Colress and whatnot, Lost Zone wouldn't appreciate this. I think it's a bit of a mild card in terms of like generic decks, so it's probably going to lean in towards control, but could end up being an option just because it is a solid item card that can be tutored at the right time.
There's also, just for anyone that's super worried about the card as well, there's also that random Amoonguss that never saw any play from Silver Tempest that makes the opponent discard their hand if they play it into you as well. So if you're super worried, there actually are ways that you can play around it, but
that will never happen,
it's
Jack.
never going to be around.
That will never happen.
Anyway, onto Emergency Board. We've seen these skateboard kind of cards before, and they're usually pretty good. Emergency Board, as always, reduces the retreat cost of the Pokemon it's attached to by 1, but also if the Pokemon has 30 HP or less, it actually reduces it down to 0. So I think in general, the second half of the text is pretty irrelevant until we know exactly where the format will be and what's going to have less than 30 HP after a certain number of hits or whatever. We can't really say much about it, but I think in general, you can kind of ignore this because the key part is actually just having another one of these retreating tools that we don't really have right now. Since we lost Air Balloon, we've really been reliant on switching effects affect like physical switches and stuff. And we're losing escape rope with the rotation. We're getting prime catcher, but in general, we're taking a net loss. So having emergency board as a switching option is always going to be good. It's typically good on things like comphase and stuff. And I think it is really good in the Lost Zone engines, just getting an extra retreat here and there. Over the course of the game, you'll still get like 4 retreats out of this potentially. So it kind of pays for itself, especially if you only play like 2 or 3 of these. You might even gain a space compared to old decks. So yeah, really good for those kinds of cards. We're losing View from Celebrations, of course, but any cards like that see play that typically have like an active effect that we see in the future as well are always going to be appreciative of this card. So yeah, it's just really, really nice to use. In general, we also it's still a Confay deck, but we kind of said the outlook for Tina with Mist Energy being revealed, which is basically like the big parasol from before, protecting effects of attacks on the opponent it's attached to. Obviously, you can't Star Requiem through that, so maybe Tina has to start looking at things like the Temple of Sinnoh as an option, meaning they maybe can't play Jet Energy anymore. So it might be even more important for Tina than some other Lost Box decks. But yeah, just in general, a really nice card to have. Not as broken as some of the previous board cards, but I think this one will still definitely see play, especially while Confay is still in the format, just because it lets you Confay dance just that little bit easier to start getting into basically Mirage Gate range, which is kind of one of the dream the deck has.
Yeah, and with Arven in format as well, this is a nice extra option. Now Arven could end up being that helpful switching card as well as getting like Ball Search in the mix, so that's kind of cool. On some supporters, we have Bianca's Sincerity. You get to heal all damage from one of your Pokemon that has 30 hit points or less remaining. Don't really know what this little theme is between these two cards, to be honest with you. Skateboarding around with Bianca. But yeah, I think it's going to be quite limited. Again, it's going to be one of those situations where we have to wait and see for those sorts of archetypes that damage themselves or can tank a certain amount of damage just by that little threshold of hit points and want to have that healing. But it seems super narrow. You know, we already have Churro in the format, and I think this Bianca in general is just going to be far more limited than that ever will be.
Another controlling sort of card, we have Eerie, a supporter that says look at your opponent's hand and choose 2 item cards you find there and discard them. Pretty strong effect, to be honest. Being able to pick and choose a couple of key items is quite nice. I've seen some people comparing it to Getsis. It's nowhere near as good as Getsis, but it's still good enough as a one-off in some of these controlling archetypes. Getsis was like just a really good card because it was also card draw as well, whereas this isn't. This is just purely for those archetypes that are trying to disrupt the hand. But this, in combination with Clippers, can actually reduce the hand down to like 3 or 4, depending on how many items they choose to keep as well. So yeah, that in combination, I don't think this is going to see much more than maybe like a one-of in some of the controlling Snorlax decks, maybe a 2-of just because we lose Peonia. But in general, again, probably not good enough for sort of general play in other decks, but really good for controlling archetypes, just as a different layer of control that they have now for being able to get rid of like switching outs and stuff for Snorlax.
Yeah, I thought control was getting a lot worse, but as soon as I saw this supporter, I felt that Blocklax could be around for a lot longer just because this hits the main thing you're trying to target, right, which is their pivoting options. So that seems like a really big
and ace spec,
upgrade.
Yeah,
and it gets Prime Catcher, right? And it gets ace specs, yeah.
That's horrid.
Speaking of, we have a couple of new ace specs. So there's an ancient and a future ace spec that we have revealed. Both pretty interesting, actually, which is a surprise to both of us, really, because you have to be such a high power level to even be a consideration up against Prime Catcher. But we first have the Drum of Awakening, the Ancient Ace spec. You get to draw a card for each of your Ancient Pokemon in play. That's quite simply very, very good burst draw on an item. It's not really understated to say that this is one of the most powerful items we've seen since, like, Oak or Bill or whatever. Obviously, it's quite pigeonholed into only Ancient decks can play this. Look at Ancient decks that we currently have. There's obviously Roaring Moon, there's the potentially new Raging Bolt EX deck. Both of these will have a decent number of ancient Pokemon in play, so we could be drawing, 4, 5, maybe even 6 cards at the high end with certain archetypes, and that's a huge burst. That's a supporter effect on an item card. Really, really powerful digging option. And what I think is important is that a lot of these ancient decks are so reliant on Sada, which only draws 3 cards, so it normally has to supplement its draw power with the likes of Pokestop and Trekking Shoes and that sort of stuff. So having this drum is actually right in with that theme of cycling through the deck and just making sure that you aren't whiffing on Sadas, which is exceptional. And yeah, I think it could go up against Prime Catcher. My main sort of beef with this card is that because you're playing Sardas, you're obviously not playing boss in the ancient decks on those turns where you need to accelerate. So even if you are using this drum, what are you actually drawing into unless you haven't already hit your Sarda? Whereas Prime Catcher, it's a perfect card to combine with Sarda because you can accelerate, get your attackers online, and still gust the most important thing in the room. So looking at like Turbo Roaring Moon decks, I think it probably still plays the Prime Catcher. I think a similar thing for the Raging Bolt deck. So I actually think Prime Catcher does outclass the drum in the couple of decks that we've already seen, but I do think possibly the new Roaring Moon single prize deck that we'll talk about in a moment will be playing this card instead. So I think there will be a home for it, but I think unlike the next one we're going to talk about, this one is still below the bar of Prime Catcher for the decks that we're looking at in terms of the ancient decks because of just how tied closely they are to Sada and how limiting that is for their sort of plays throughout the game.
I think both of these are like I don't think we could have nuttier effects to be honest, but yeah, that's how powerful Prime Catcher is. Though Reboot Bot, the future ace spec, might actually compete with it, and we've kind of discussed this, and we think in pretty much all future decks, if you're trying to build around future, Reboot Bot is just worth playing. You'll kind of understand the kind of future deck we're talking about momentarily when we talk about some of the Pokemon, but the ace spec itself says for each of your future Pokemon in play, choose a basic energy from your discard pile and attach it to that Pokemon. So you can get up to 6 energy on an item card from your discard pile into play, which is insane. That's obviously nutty, but I think even if this picks up like 3 energy, it's already very, very good. People are running generators and huge energy counts in like Miraidon to try and hit double generator, which is a random effect, and it feels crazy when it hits 2. This is, whilst it's only a one-off, this is like a guaranteed reload as well. So whilst you're not able to do sort of tempo-y things with, or as tempo-y things with it as you are with the electro generator, this is a really good mid-game reload, so you don't need to run any other sort of ways of trying to accelerate energy. And this is so good, we might even see cards that try and get it back into the deck, things like Silene plus Greninja to draw back into it. I think it's actually potentially that good, just being able to play a couple of reboots and trying to get much more energy acceleration in the mid game to keep you going. Future decks look like have a lot of damage mods, which is kind of we'd kind of alluded to that with Iron Valiant EX in the previous set, but we've had even more cards that kind of play to the strengths of that. And anyone remembers the old Plasma deck, TDK, Thunderous, Deoxys, and Kyurem? It feels very similar to that, how the sort of deck could look. So, and one of the biggest things about that deck was just having that energy acceleration, and it didn't necessarily have great mid-game acceleration outside of like specific special energy. This is very, very sort of versatile basic energy acceleration, which means you can attach the right key energy to your Pokemon. You can play multiple different types of energy and stuff like that, and still be able to use them multiple times. So yeah, very, very powerful card. You'll kind of understand why a little bit more momentarily when we talk about some of the future cards and maybe how a future box would look. But this looks to be a very, very powerful piece in that deck to help you sort of in the mid game, keeping up with your energy attachments and some of the powerful attackers that the deck has.
Yeah, definitely a huge selling point card, and I think helps carve out a future box like we've mentioned. Let's jump up to the top because there are some interesting Pokemon to discuss as well. The first one is going to be Metang. It's a stage 1 100 hit point metal type with the Metal Maker ability. Once during a turn, you can look at the top 4 cards of your deck, choose any number of basic metal energy you find there, and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like, then shuffle the other cards and put them to the bottom of your deck, which is quite crucial, actually, so that if you are potentially using multiple of these, your ratios, I suppose, aren't exactly getting better because you've just stripped your deck of energy, but they're not getting worse because the ones that weren't energy aren't still in the mix for the next Metal Maker. So it's almost like using an electric generator, right? It's one less card, but you can still burst that energy like across the board, and it can go anywhere as well. It can be split up between your Pokemon, and it can go directly onto the active position. So this ability is actually quite strong. We are lacking a bit of evolution search right now, which is a bit of a shame. So it's going to be a bit of work to get multiple Metang up and running. And also just the fact that it's basic metal energy also limits this card slightly, I would say. Looking at the best metal stuff we have in formats, it could be really fun for a Dialga V-Star, where we can be trying to take those 2 turns once again, which is always a great thing to work towards, and I think Metang could be helping Dialga in that endeavor. But there's also things like Revavroom EX, which can be quite tanky in the formats. There's the new Iron Treads EX coming out from the Paldean Fates format as well, which can also be doing some decent tanking. When it's got a future booster capsule attached, it takes like 150 less damage or something stupid like that. So yeah, Matang could be trying to power up some interesting metal stuff. There's also some interesting colorless stuff like Regigigas V-Star, which we've seen recently paired with Arceus. So if we have some of these cards that have that mostly colorless attack cost, there could be ways for this Matang to see play, but it is still hard to justify an archetype that relies on this stage 1 acceleration when you're not evolving into a stage 1 that then helps you like draw cards. It's really just hoping for the best with those ratios. But as we've seen with Miraidon, there is precedent to play like 15 or 16 energy and have good odds of this being some pretty good acceleration, and obviously having rods and stuff in the mix to make this better. So certainly a promising card, and definitely is a huge boon for metal decks. There aren't really many in the format right now, which is why I think it's one that has like potential for the future. But it does unlock some doors, and if we get better evolution search, this card obviously gets way stronger.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's one of the weakest parts about the card. It's just the fact that you have to basically like ultra ball for it sometimes, and that feels super bad. So yeah, it's a shame because I think the ability is really cool. Pikachu and Raichu are kind of cool arts, but they're not really worth talking about too much. You've got some fun little arts. Yeah, I think Pikachu looks great, and Raichu just looks like he's having a nap, which is hilarious. They just do some spread damage, but while Manapee's in the format, it's not really worth chatting about, to be honest. Luxury EX we'll talk about just because it's an EX Pokemon. It's one of these Terra EXs. It's a lightning type, but it's powered up by water energy. So keep that in mind for your decks that maybe are already running water energy. Troika Pump is the first attack for 1 water energy, and you discard up to 3 energy cards from your hand. Then choose one of your opponent's Pokemon, and you do 60 damage for each energy it's discarded. It's quite a powerful snipe attack, to be honest, but again, we have plenty of bench barrier right now. We've actually had another bench barrier card revealed recently as well, so it's a little bit more complicated than just putting a Manaphy down, but even so, bench barrier isn't going anywhere, so that's kind of going to be the biggest limitation. But realistically, like, that's quite a powerful attack. A 180 snipe for 1 energy, but having to get these energy into your hand, you're going to have to, play things like superior energy retrieval and stuff. So it's a little bit complicated, but quite interesting at least. And then Tingly Bolt doesn't really do too much, just does 120, and they can't retreat. So yeah, nothing to write home about, especially while we have Manaphy in the format.
There's also Stage 2 Gengar EX Pokemon. Again, not super impressive. Great artwork, though. 310 hit points, weakness to fighting, to retreats, the Corroding Curse. Whenever your opponent attaches an energy from their hand to one of their Pokemon, put 2 counters onto that Pokemon. We've seen this over and over again, and it's been many years since this sort of ability has been that relevant as like a pseudo damage modifier. And the Trick Step for 2 Dark does 160, and you move an energy from your opponent's active to one of their benched Pokemon. We have so much great acceleration in the format that this is really going to make a huge difference. So yeah, it's low damage output, a lot of work for a stage 2, and the payoff's just not there, unfortunately.
Similarly, Shiftry is not really worth going into too much. It's got a attack that shuffles Pokemon in. I don't think it's quite worth getting a stage 2 out to let your opponent keep 3 benched Pokemon. They're going to be keeping the draw engines and their next attacker and stuff. So yeah, not really worth investing time into. But another interesting stage 2 is for Alligator. Again, probably not quite good enough to see play, but it does have some pretty cool text. Torrent Heart is the ability. Once during your turn, you may put 5 damage counters on this Pokemon. If you do, this Pokemon's attack does 120 more damage. So that makes Great Wave do 280, which is kind of the perfect number for these V-Star Pokemon. Really cool to see being able to uptrade. Takes 2 water, which is a bit awkward. We have ways of accelerating waters, but they're not great because they're usually stage 2 based, or maybe we're going to have to play Palkia and stuff like that. So that's kind of the hurdles that you have to overcome with for Alligator, but really cool ability, and very, like, they've actually given it it's doing enough damage to hit a key number, which is quite cool, while still doing enough damage in 1 prize matchups to be like this 180 like bulky Pokemon that's still knocking stuff out. So yeah, a fun little 1 prizer, but I think realistically not quite going to see success as a like proper archetype.
We have Whimsicott. It's a grass type stage 1 with 100 hit points, 1 retreat cost, and the ability Lifting Heal. Once during a turn, when you play this Pokemon to evolve, you may use the ability Heal all damage from your active grass Pokemon. If you do, discard all energy from that Pokemon. So a little max potion effect that you get from just putting a stage 1 Pokemon into play, which isn't too difficult, I would think. We're lacking great grass types. I think Meowscarada's kind of the only one that springs to mind where you could simply reattach a double turbo energy and continue to swing. Quite limited in its options, but a great one to have in mind for future grass tanking style decks, because the effect is obviously very strong. We're just really lacking cards that can abuse the Whimsicott right now.
Relicanth has the Deep in Memories. this ability that says each of your evolved Pokemon can use any attacks of its previous evolutions. We've seen this kind of ability before. I'm going to be completely honest. I haven't done my due diligence in working out what is best with this, but one of the best partners is actually the Incineroar EX that I will talk about momentarily. But yeah, this is just a good card to keep in mind. There could be some key players here and there, some key decks that you maybe want to be able to pick and choose some attacks from the previous evolutions out. I don't know whether there's anything you can think of, Joe, other than basically the Litten that we're going to talk about in a few moments' time.
Yeah, I had a look at every like relevant stage 2 and 1 that we already have in the game, and there really isn't much outside of like maybe Regigigas V-Star has Angry Whack, which does more damage if it's, you know, got counters on it and stuff. But yeah, it seems quite limited right now. I think the Litten and the Gigas were the two that stood out to me. Everything else looks kind of mid.
Yeah, makes sense. So the reason why I mentioned Litten is because we have an Incineroar EX that we will talk about. Incineroar EX is a 320 HP stage 2 with the Adversity Act ability. Attacks used by this Pokemon cost 1 colorless less for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Not a bad ability when you have 4 colorless in your attack cost. Blazing Bomb dealing 240 damage, and Burning, so effectively 260. Pretty good number, not quite hitting that perfect V-Star number, but still a pretty good number to be hitting, especially if you're able to reduce this cost. I think ultimately this card is just kind of competing a little bit with some other powerful stage 2 Pokemon, things like Gardevoir decks and Charizard, to be honest. But one selling point is that combination with the a previous Litten that I think was in Silver Tempest, correct if I'm wrong. It was a Silver Tempest card that basically says for 2 fire energy, you do 20 damage times the number of counters on you. So Incineroar should be at least tanking a hit in most cases. So you hopefully are able to throw back an attack for 2 fire energy that will potentially be doing more than Blazing Bomb. So that's kind of the way to build the deck, I think. There's also an interesting like Walling Torracat, which isn't particularly good, but it's better than the Torracat above. So yeah, there's like a couple of cool things you can do. I think it's hard to justify this in a format where we have some very powerful stage 2s. One of them already it's a dark type but has fire energy in it anyway, so you can already run things like the Radiant Charizard as well for that fire type coverage. So it's in a bit of a precarious spot, but there are some cool synergies there, and maybe you want to play around with being able to do some huge damage with that Litten attack just by popping a Relicanth down after you've maybe done like a small hit or hit something else as well. It's quite a fun little combo there.
It's like a higher tempo Charizard, but obviously has less of a powerful late game. But you can see the same engine basically imported into here, right? That the Charizard is currently playing, so definitely has potential. We have a Farigiraf EX, a pretty scary Terrestrial stage 1 actually. 260 hit point, dark type, weak to grass. With 2 retreats, the Armor Tail is the ability preventing all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's basic Pokemon EX. So it's not going to wall out pretty much everything, because as we know, most of the all basic decks that we have in the game are a mixture of EX and V Pokemon, and sometimes some single prizes weaved in. So it's not going to completely wall out decks, outside of maybe I'm thinking things like the new Raging Bolt EX lacks a really high damage output single prize option, something like that. Jumping off the page, I don't think right now it's going to be this amazing tech card. It can't be its own deck, similar to how we've seen like Pyro in the past or anything. It's too narrow for that. But it could be a hurdle if we start seeing a huge amount of play for certainly some of these like Turbo Ancient decks, because obviously you can Mist Energy against Roaring Moon as well to be not worried about the effective attacks from the Frenzied Gouging, so that could be interesting. Its damage is Sneaky Beam for 160, for 1 Psychic and 2 Colorless Energy, you do 30 to one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. It's a good enough damage to get through most single prize Pokemon, so if they are using non-EXs to try and punch into you and whatnot, you can fight them fairly nicely, and you do have basic Psychic Girafarig, so maybe it's like a 1-1 tech inclusion in like Guardy to get around Iron Hands and Miraidon and a few of their options. That's kind of the only thing that I can think about like right now. We've seen how like Deoxys V-Star's been a mini packaging Guardian. This could be like another alternative. Kind of interesting card, and definitely one that we like forever have to think about in our deck building process, because if ever there's a situation where you only have EX attackers in your deck, you can be exploited as a basic engine. So that's a small thing to bear in mind. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like it's going to be this terrifying walling option.
On to the ancient Pokemon, and we're going to start with Roaring Moon, another really interesting Roaring Moon card. It's a dark type, 140 HP basic, so already pretty chunky, and you've got the tool as well to boost up to 200, which is actually quite scary. Vengeful Feathers is the main attack on here as well. For 2 Dark Energy, you're doing 70 plus 10 more for each ancient card in your discard pile. So one of these revenge style attacks sort of does more damage the later on in the game. We have some very powerful ancient cards already, and a lot of these ancient cards actually synergize really well with Roaring Moon. Things like Sada, being able to get this around this awkward 2 dark cost. You don't necessarily have to play Dark Patches. I think Dark Patches is still pretty good, but you don't have to play them. So you've got Sada to help that. You've got the Hapu reprint, which is an ancient supporter. I can't quite remember the name of it, but it's that's another really good. That's another really good supporter just for turboing through the deck and also discarding some ancient cards that maybe you don't need. We've got the Flutter Main, which is ability lock, which we haven't really talked about on the channel, but was revealed a few weeks ago that now seems like it maybe has a home, which is really cool as a great starter to be able to sort of try and cheese a win here and there and slow down the opponent if they go first. You've got a couple of really cool multi-prizes as well. You've got the normal Roaring Moon, which can just serve as like a delete button pretty much for anything that Roaring Moon, the baby Roaring Moon wouldn't be able to get through. You've got the tools as well. So you can quite easily get into like 28, maybe even 30 cards with Ancient on them. And unlike some previous Vengeance style Pokemon, they don't have to all be Pokemon. So you don't end up with this like clunky mess of hands where you've got loads of Pokemon that you just have to keep binning and stuff like that. Sometimes because you're playing supporters and stuff, you're actually able to play like a more cohesive deck, which actually is really cool because they've kind of supplemented that with the fact that you're starting with more like base damage. And so base 70 is already a really good starting point. So with like 28, we can see situations where you can actually make it all the way to one-shotting, maybe even things like a Charizard EX in the late game, which is pretty crazy just by naturally playing your game plan. You don't really have to go too far out of your way as well. So yeah, it seems like a really, really powerful deck. I think initially I wasn't blown away. I thought it was going to be a little bit more sort of niche, but I actually think now there's enough here to be able to compete in the format. We've seen various different sort of 1+2 prize decks in the past do well. Most recently, like Clorf Electrode is kind of a type coverage deck that seems to be it's basically being ripped apart by rotation. This could be a pretty good replacement that I actually just think sounds much more cohesive. It's playing arguably just better raw cards, and you've also got like that big blow up option of the Roaring Moon EX as well. So yeah, the more I think about this, the more impressive I think this card is. Speedwing isn't really going to be doing too much. I think after like turn 2, Vengeful Feathers will always be doing more damage, but it's there at least. So yeah, it's a pretty bulky basic Pokemon, and yeah, it looks to be a really, really good one. We already had some very powerful ancient Pokemon revealed in the EXs, but it looks like we also have some one prize options as well. So yeah, really cool time to try out some of these ancient decks. I think this is a really cool archetype.
Yeah, this one's right up my street. I'm definitely going to get testing with it, and Koraidon might actually make it into that deck because it's another really good single prize attacking option that has possibly some earlier damage output threat. It's a dragon type that has obviously no weakness and 2 retreats, and for 1 fighting, 1 colorless, you deal 30 times the amount of your ancient Pokemon in play. So obviously with 6, 180, pretty decent threshold that you have available to you. I don't think you need to go too crazy with it, but I think this could be a one-of in the Raging Bolt deck where you're already going to have a number of Raging Bolts in play, and it could be a solid enough beat stick to get through other single prize Pokemon when that deck's obviously playing Sada already has fighting energy in the deck list. I think this would go alongside things like the new Sandy Shocks or possibly the Flutter Mane that we already have in format as some of your like one-of one prize Pokemon to try and help you out here. And then Shred as well is another option that we've seen in the past can be reasonable. I don't necessarily think there's any ancient deck that I'm trying to build that has this attack cost, but if ever you need to have the Shred effect, it's something to like bear in mind as well, which is kind of okay.
We have a Great Tusk as well. This is another ancient Pokemon. This is a little bit different. This is more of a milling option. Crust Collapse for 2 colorless. Discards the top card of your opponent's deck, and then if you played an ancient supporter from this from your hand during this turn, you discard 3 more cards. So that's a total of 4. It's a decent chunk. It's not going to be. You're still going to need to like get a few Crust Collapses off, and given you're going to have to probably be finding Sards and stuff, it may be quite difficult to chain these Great Tusks if you're not able to find your Sards and things like that, because then your whole strategy kind of relies on trying to play some supporter cards that are quite powerful, but in combination, you want to be trying to disrupt your opponent as well. So there are some like kinks here and there, but I think this is one of the better mill archetypes we've had in a little while. I think it's quite a cool concept. I don't think there's going to be I don't think we need to worry too much. I think there's enough to sort of be worried about this alongside like a stalling option like Snorlax. I think Snorlax would ultimately be a better controlling deck, but this plus the Clippers plus some tools that buff its HP and stuff could be a fun little archetype. And every now and again these mill archetypes do sort of pop up out of nowhere and do well for a little while and then disappear. So yeah, I think this is one of the more interesting ones we've had in a little while, and I'll be interested to see whether there's like enough milling cards to actually get us there, or whether we're not quite there yet and we just have to play Great Tuskon as more of a fun option.
Yeah, I'm terrified that this is going to be the new like ladder deck that we see every day, where it's just going to be Clippers, counter catchers, and, and this guy. I can see it for sure. We have a single prize Iron Valiant. It's a psychic type and has 2 attacks. The first one is calculation for a psychic. You look at the top 4 cards of your deck and put them back in any order. But the Majesty Sword is kind of a little bit more interesting. For 2 psychic and 1 colorless, you deal 100 damage. Plus, if you played a future supporter card from your hand during his turn, you do an additional 100 damage. 200 for 3, a solid rate, but as we know, the damage output can be buffed by Iron Crown EX as well as your future boost energy capsule. So this could be allowing you to uptrade into some other, basic EX Pokemon quite comfortably. The main future supporter we'd probably look towards is the Cryptomaniac, which is obviously putting 2 cards on top of your deck, has synergy with, your Greninja, your Pokestops. With that psychic attack cost, it makes me think of like possibly a Xatu deck, which would work very nicely with Cryptomaniac, because I don't think it necessarily makes it into a future toolbox where we're going to use the Miraidon that we'll talk about in a moment, and the new A spec. I think it's not quite good enough. It's kind of too expensive of an attacker in that sort of deck. But it could end up being a one-of in Xatu just to skew the prize race.
Miraidon is it says a lightning type. It's actually a dragon type, 110 HP basic future mon. And this is kind of the Thunderous. This is the piece that I think future decks have been missing. It's that energy acceleration alongside the reboot bot that actually makes some of these future decks look really quite threatening, to be honest. Speed Peak for 1 colorless does 40 damage, and you search your deck for up to 2 basic energy and attach them to your future Pokemon in any way you like. So this is very, very reminiscent of that Thunderous back from the Plasma era. This is really, really good for starting to get additional energy attachments. I still feel like a lot of the time you're going to be going Miraidon into some of your other attackers. But Speed Peak with damage rods from Iron Crown and the future boost energy capsule, all of this kind of stuff can actually mean that you're doing a significant amount of damage, maybe even taking prizes on sort of Roltzes and Frigibaxes and stuff like that, or even two-shotting some low HP X's and V Pokemon, which is really impressive because it means that Miraidon actually is still, whilst it's also progressing your board state, it's still taking some prizes as well if you have enough damage mods on your side, which is pretty cool. It's not only that, though, it's also a really nice sort of single prize attacking option, sparking attack, just as a flat 160 for 3 energy. The awkward energy cost is kind of supplemented by the fact that Speed Peak tutors out the exact energy you need, which is really nice, along with Reboot Bot sort of filling in the gaps. And 160, again, is buffed up quite easily into low HP, EX, and V Pokemon range. Can easily be hitting 220 with this, which is kind of a nice threshold to hit. Yeah, you can definitely be up trading in the mid to late game with this as well, which is really interesting. I'm quite excited about this whole archetype. I think this kind of future box seems really cool. Iron Crown is a really, really interesting, quite powerful card. We already have Valiant, which is very powerful in a vacuum and has obviously seen some success as well on its own, so maybe we'll play that. I think it's going to be interesting to see what different types of attackers you can play in here. But in general, just playing Lightnings and Psychics and sticking to 2 energy types and just having some very, very powerful damage mods and efficient attackers, it seems like this is going to be a really, really powerful archetype. And again, just that Reboot Bot is so strong for keeping you going in the mid game where Speed Peak isn't doing it anymore and you need to actually start taking knockouts with some of your other attacks, maybe Sparking Attack or some of these EX options. Having that Reboot Bot to kind of do an extra Miraidon's job, maybe even 2 if you have a way of cycling it in, is going to be really powerful as well. So yeah, I think this is potentially a really good archetype. I think both the Future box and the Roaring Moon Ancient box, the Vengeance style deck, look to be 2 archetypes that come into the format and hit the ground running, to be honest. I'm really interested to see where they fall, and I think they could both be very, very competitive, to be honest.
Yeah, super impressive card. Just having that reboot and then having like E switches and like EXP shares to go alongside the early speed peak pressure seems like it is probably going to be enough, which is cool. There's another future mon which I think has maybe some potential, but its attack cost is kind of limiting. Having a metal plus colorless in its attack cost is annoying for this Iron Treads, but its ability, Dual Core, says that if it has a future boost energy capsule attached, it's both fighting and metal type. So you do have a couple of nice type coverages, obviously going to help out against like Iron Hands, Miraidon, Chien-Pao as well, which might be making a small resurgence thanks to the Buddy Poffin and obviously Path going away. So it seems quite memey. 60 damage seems really low, but if you're already having to future boost it up, and if you already have crowns in the making, getting to 120 shouldn't be all that difficult, and you get to move energy off this Pokemon as well, so could be an efficient means of actually getting through some type coverage Pokemon. I think you'd have to be playing a future box that already has like Luminous Energy in it, for example, or some way to pay that cost, because that's the only thing that I think's limiting right now for it. But you always have to be cautious of these dual type Pokemon, especially when there's damage mods in the format, because it ends up being able to actually collateral a few things. So something there to be sure. But yeah, that really rounds things out. Like Jack said, the potential for a reboot future deck, the potential for a drumming Roaring Moon deck seemed like the two big selling points. And then also the fact that we have some cool controlling cards for not just Snorlax, but also potentially for the new Great Tusk. They seem like really big additions to the format. The Incineroar, a potential new Stage 2 Pokemon that the jury's kind of out, is probably weaker than Charizard, but it could be a higher tempo card, and maybe that's just good enough. The tempo of Metang, if we can get that working towards some powerful attackers, it's just another option that we have in the meta. This set is already looking like absolutely monstrous. You're going to have to get some just for the A-specs alone, but it looks like we're getting a number of new decks coming out from this set. The potential of Raging Bolt, the ones that we've discussed today. Yeah, there's just so much going on with this new expansion alongside a rotation as well. It's going to be a massive freshen up, I think.
Yeah, I think this is the of the 5 sets we've had from Scarlet and Violet is another set that looks to be a real meta shake-up. So yeah, really exciting, and can't wait to have rotation as well. So yeah, we'll leave it on this beautiful Pikachu art. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in another video tomorrow.